Imagine Robert Stack of Unsolved Mysteries telling you about a mysterious case involving a man disappearing from a train station, only for his son to get a telegram 8 years later telling him to come quick because his father was dying. Now, imagine me telling you about it, and you've got this episode. The story of Robert Opdyke is a story of 19th century economic growth in Birmingham, a recession, and yes, at least one mystery. This is Birmingham Uncovered, a podcast by the Birmingham Museum where we are exploring the diverse and compelling lives that built Birmingham, Michigan into the community that it is today. First, some background on Birmingham. We are a city of approximately 20,000 people over 4.73 square miles, approximately halfway between Detroit and Pontiac and Oakland County. This area was occupied by members of the Three Fires Confederacy of Indigenous People before white settlement in the area started in the late 18 teens. Birmingham became a city in 1933 and today is known as a prosperous and multifaceted community with a thriving cultural scene. Robert Opdyke was born in 1812 in New Jersey to Anthony and Anna Lindaberry Opdyke and was the oldest son of 10 children. Unfortunately, we have no records on if Robert had a stereotypical New Jersey accent, but we do know that none of his sisters were named Snooky, which is a shame. I have taken to nicknaming Robert the Situation in my head, though, which helps. At some point before May 1844, Robert married Anna Stiles. As we've touched on in previous episodes, lots of records from the early 1800s can be somewhat spotty, and sometimes we have to give our best educated guesses to fill in the blanks. In this case, Robert and Anna's daughter, Anna Frances Opdyke, was born in May 1844, and there's nothing to indicate that her parents weren't married when she was born. By that point, Robert and Anna were living in Massachusetts. Also of note, Anna Stiles Opdyke's mother was also named Anna too. That's 3 Annas in as many generations. I'm not going to tell you to name your kid Khaleesi or Golgotha or whatever, but if it's between that or naming your kid the same thing as everyone else in the family, think of the future historians and go for the unique name. Like a lot of folks from our previous episodes, Robert and Anna moved further west with their young family. We find them in the 1850 census living in Madison County, Ohio, where Robert was recorded by the census as a superintendent of a railroad. The census of 1850 took down much more information than previous censuses, including the names, ages, nativity, race, and occupations for all free males aged 15 and older. Railroad superintendent could here refer to a couple of different jobs. One could be a superintendent of the train itself, kind of like a chief mechanic, or they could be a superintendent in charge of a station or stretch of the railroad. Either way, Robert was performing skilled labor, probably making around $1 a day in a decade where, in Ohio, a farm laborer could expect 85 cents per day, and a female housekeeper $2 per week. To put that into perspective, in a neighboring county, an acre of land was about $16. And in a big city like Philadelphia, the amount spent for a family of 5 for rent, utilities, food, and clothing was estimated to be a little over $10 a week. Robert Opdyke was in a field that was rapidly expanding. Take the California Gold Rush in 1848 to 1855, for example, when thousands of Americans, and so many folks from other countries as well, migrated out west to seek their fortunes. The only problem was that the only method of getting out there was via ship that, if it left from a port on the east or Gulf Coast, had to go all the way around the tip of South America in order to reach the west coast of the United States. The Panama Canal, which opened up a sea passage through Central America, wasn't completed until 1914. Additionally, as more American settlers found their way into the Midwest in the 1820s and 1830s, Fast and efficient ways of transportation were needed to get goods and people around. The earliest railroads in Ohio at this time primarily connected the fertile farmlands of the Ohio River Valley with the Great Lakes. More trains and railroads were needed. In 1850, the nation only had approximately 9,000 miles of rail lines in active service, and through the decade that number tripled to over 30,000 miles by 1860, built by numerous competing companies. A journey from New York to Chicago took about a month on the roads in a vehicle fueled by animal power, but only took about 2 days on the railroad. In 1869, the most famous railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, was completed, connecting the nation's east and west coasts. Railroads were the foundation upon which America's coming industrial revolution was based. There couldn't be large-scale manufacturing without a cheap and quick way to ship those goods. Nor could folks flock to the city to work in mills and factories without a way to get massive amounts of food and goods to population centers. So why did Robert Opdyke leave his job and move to Michigan? By the next census, Robert Opdyke is in the Birmingham Bloomfield area, and his occupation in the census of that year is given as farmer. In 1856, his son, John Stuart Opdyke, was born in Pontiac. Why did the Opdykes leave Ohio just a few years after they got there? And why did he leave a job in such a rapidly expanding field? We don't fully know the answer to that question in the Opdykes case, but we do know why other families were moving to the area. Michigan in the 1850s and 1860s had a booming agricultural economy that promised lots of jobs and opportunities, with good farmland available that wasn't too expensive and with great natural resources, like forests and waterways. Michigan had only been a state for a little over a decade, and its population was booming. And not only did the Birmingham area have lots of trees and lots of waters, but it was also very close to Pontiac, which was a thriving city and Oakland County's seat. Also nearby was Detroit, which was, even before the automotive industry, the commercial and industrial center of Michigan. In the mid-1800s, railroads connected Birmingham to both cities and much of the surrounding area, which meant that people and the goods that they produced were only a short train ride away from major population centers. Birmingham itself, due to its location along the Saginaw Trail, now Woodward Avenue, and its close proximity to Pontiac and Detroit, had made it a commercial center of its very own. In 1863, Robert shows up at the tax records as owning one house, one horse, a carriage, and a harness. 2 years later, he added a gold watch to his taxable assets. While these records seem fairly mundane, they can help us see just how financially well off the Opdyke family was becoming. The tax records only show the people that owned things, though, and they don't really give us a very good picture of the percentage of folks in the community that owned or rented property, or who didn't own horses or gold watches. It also attributes all of the family's assets to the husband or father, due to the principle of coverture, taken from English common law. Under this principle, a married woman didn't exist as a legal entity separate from her husband, so any assets that she came into the marriage with or acquired during it were his legally to do whatever he wanted to do with. It was only in the early 1900s, during the women's rights movement, when many married women across the country had the right to their own paychecks. And even later still, when married women were allowed to open bank accounts or credit cards under their own names. The economic landscape was just about to undergo a massive shift that would change how everyday Americans lived, worked, and consumed goods. The Industrial Revolution in the United States was a period of time in which labor largely went from agricultural and farm labor to manufacturing labor. Many historians put this revolution as taking place from 1870 through World War II. Factories needed labor, and the mining, forestry, and other industries that supplied the fuel to run the machinery in these factories needed more labor to keep up with demand. Many folks flocked to the cities to take these new jobs, which not only shifted demographics. Between 1860 and 1900, many cities doubled, tripled, or even quadrupled their populations. But it also shifted how folks lived. Many of those moving to the cities had previously lived in houses on farms or homesteads, and now they lived in apartments that they rented alongside many other families. But just for funsies, let's get a guesstimate of the percentage of home ownership in the 1860s. Now, in 1890, 47.8% of Americans owned their own homes. And let's adjust slightly upward for 1865, as people weren't yet flocking to cities en masse. So maybe about 55% of Americans owned their own homes. So the Opdykes, owning their own home, were doing pretty good. Additionally, the horse and harness on the tax rolls of 1863 aren't the most pricey, but they aren't the worst quality on the list. The Opdykes appear to be doing pretty well for themselves. Additionally, in the 1860 census, there are two seemingly unrelated young adults in the family household, perhaps servants, boarders, or farmhands. Boarders provided the family with a bit of extra income, while servants or farmhands provided the labor to make the house and farm more productive. At some point between 1860, when Robert Opdyke reports his occupation as farming, and 1870, he acquires the flour mill in Birmingham. The Opdyke family genealogical history states that he traded the farm to R.E. Trowbridge for the mill. In the 1870 census, he reports that he is a miller by trade. And, coincidentally, Trowbridge listed himself as a miller in the 1860 census and a farmer in the 1870 census. On the surface, this looks like a great business opportunity for Robert. As the Industrial Revolution picked up steam, there was to be more and more demand for processed goods like flour by folks who lived in cities and didn't have access to grains that they grew or milled themselves. Additionally, flour was an essential ingredient for most homes at the time, as breads, biscuits, cakes, and other gluten-laden foods were made by hand in the home and formed a big part of the diet. Even in hard economic times, most households wouldn't be cutting back substantially on their flour purchases. And, thanks to the railroads, the flour produced could now go farther faster, meaning that new markets for goods in far-flung parts of the United States were opening up. And the mill he purchased, located a very convenient distance from both Detroit and Pontiac, as well as being positioned just a little ways off of what is today Woodward Avenue, the main road through Oakland County, to serve many neighboring communities, looked like a great investment. The mill itself was built along the Rouge River in the 1830s by a man with both the best name in the history of Birmingham and who gave Birmingham its name, Roswell T. Merrill. In the 1830s, he decided that the community should be named after Birmingham, England, and he began putting up signs to that effect, and everyone just went along with it. There had also been a sawmill built around that stretch of river as well, and sometimes folks get confused and conflate the two mills, but the mill that Merrill built was always a flour mill. The mill passed through several hands, and it's hard to trace exactly who owned it when, but maybe Opdyke might have owned the mill twice. It's hard to tell. Possibly Opdyke and a business partner with the last name of Gardner owned it when the mill burned down in 1858. After the fire, it passed to R.E. Trowbridge, who rebuilt it in 1860. And then Opdyke definitely owned it when he traded Trowbridge a farm for it. On older maps of Birmingham, you won't find Maple Road. Instead, you'll see a road that suspiciously looks like Maple, but is called Mill Road. Mill Road went to, you guessed it, the mill. And in a Birmingham urban legend, future podcast subject and controller of a child army, Martha Baldwin decided that it should have a nicer sounding name and planted maple trees along its length to influence the name change. And that is why the museum's address is on Maple and not Mill Road. The more you know, the more confusing it gets. Originally, in the 1830s, the mill used a wheel spun by water to power the machinery that ground grain from nearby farms into flour. Eventually, steam turbines upped the power level, and the mill's owner in the 19-teens reported that he could mill about 50 barrels of flour a day. There are several old photos of the mill that we'll put on the website, showing it on the banks of what is now called Corton Lake, but once had the much humbler name of Mill Pond. But sadly for Robert, the national economy just wasn't in his favor. While in general the economy and banking system in the U.S. rapidly expanded after the Civil War, there were a few bumps in the road. One of the biggest was the banking panic of 1873, when a large bank in New York failed, causing folks all over the country to rush to pull their own money and asset out of nearby banks, fearing that they would fail as well. Ironically, everyone pulling their money out of banks all at once caused those banks to fail. Over 100 banks failed, along with 18,000 businesses, including many railroads, and unemployment began to rise. This caused a depression that lasted several years and was even known as the Great Depression, until certain events in 1929 came to overshadow it. The Opdyke's run of good fortune was over. According to an article written later, when the mystery had been resolved, the mill was foreclosed on, and with creditors knocking at the door, Robert Opdyke took a train to Detroit on December 16, 1876, in order to do some business. He then disappeared from the depot for the Milwaukee Railroad line in Detroit, never to be seen alive by his family again. A blurb from a January 1844 issue of the Pontiac Gazette says that he was believed to have been, quote, foully dealt with, while a longer article published that same year on the west side of Michigan says that he was believed to be foully dealt with, but also that certain members of his family believed him alive somewhere on Earth. The longer article also mentions that the creditors were many, but were not clamorous. In the 1880 census, Robert's wife, Anna Stiles Opdyke, is listed as both disabled and widowed, and living with and keeping house for her youngest son, John Stewart Opdyke, a clerk in a dry goods store. Did Anna believe that Robert had been foully dealt with? Possibly, but we have to remember the creditors. Had Robert still been alive out there somewhere, his creditors could still come after his assets that Anna now held. Under the legal concept of coverture, discussed earlier, Anna had no way to protect assets or money that she may have brought to the marriage or acquired during it, because it all belonged to her husband and was thus fair game to his creditors. But if he was dead, those creditors may have backed off from a poor widow. Considering Robert dead was better socially as well. There was a social stigma attached to both abandoning a family as well as being the abandoned family. The care of an abandoned spouse and young children often fell to the community, or they would be sent off to the poor farm. And there were no social safety nets like Social Security or food stamps to help families left without a breadwinner. Many folks might have resented having to keep such families afloat. Thankfully, all three of Robert and Anna's children were adults and could fend for themselves. A 65-year-old widow keeping house for a single son was a much more respectable and secure position than a woman who had been abandoned by her spouse. There is another theory, though. What if the whole family was in on it? Perhaps Robert, in over his head financially, realized that the best way to care for his wife was to leave and get the creditors to back off. It's interesting that we don't have any evidence that Anna or his children tried to find Robert. George, Anna and Robert's eldest son, even buys the mill, and he ran it successfully before selling it for a profit and moving to Pontiac. It's an interesting idea, at least. But what the heck happened to Robert? Well, we find him in the 1880 census in Saratoga Springs, New York, with his occupation listed as a farmer. Further, he gives his marital status as married, which must have been news to Anna. What was Robert doing in Saratoga Springs, New York? In the 1870s and 1880s, the city was experiencing a building boom as it grew into an attractive vacation destination due to its springs and racecourse. Did Robert find himself missing his wife of 30-some years? Did he spare a thought for his kids, George, Anna, and John? Was he remorseful for sticking them with his debts and the mystery of his whereabouts while he started anew in America's #1 vacation destination? Unclear. But January of 1884 found this strange story finally resolved. To quote from an article in the January 10th, 1884 issue of the Lake County Star, quote, "A few days ago, the oldest son, George K. Opdyke, received a telegram from John Skidmore of Saratoga, New York, saying, 'By the time this reaches you, your father will be dead. Come.' George K. Opdyke started at once, but just before he could reach his destination, another telegram arrived, notifying the family of the father's demise. The son returned on New Year's with the remains, which were interred in the cemetery at Birmingham. At the time of Mr. Opdyke's disappearance, O. Poppleton foreclosed a mortgage on the mill property, which was then valued at $10,000. George K. Opdyke purchased the property, ran it for a number of years very successfully, and finally sold it and is now living on a farm in Pontiac. Mr. Opdyke was about 69 years of age at his death, and his demise is said to be caused by a small wound in his thumb, which suddenly began to show signs of blood poisoning, which gradually ran up his arm until his lungs were reached, and then death ensued." End quote. Orrin Poppleton, the businessman who taught John Allen Bigelow how to run a dry goods store, pops back up again, this time holding the mortgage to Birmingham's flour mill. Inflation calculations are neither super accurate nor precise before 1913, but $10,000 isn't an insignificant chunk of change today, so one can speculate how valuable that mortgage was back then. And we get an intersection with medicine at the time. Today, blood poisoning can still be quite serious for patients, but it's often successfully treated with antibiotics. But in 1883, those weren't available. Penicillin was discovered in 1923, 40 years too late to be of any help to Robert. We don't know what the wound was, but in the 1880s, it was possible that someone could die from something so commonplace as a paper cut. Also, to get back to the theory that the whole family was in on the disappearance, how did John Skidmore know where to contact George? George had moved since Robert had left. Did they perhaps keep in contact? And if Robert was such a cad, why bring him home and bury him in the family plot at Greenwood Cemetery? Also, I just want to point out how much I hate that newspapers at this time continually shorten George to Geo. Why not also shorten Robert to Rob? Why list everyone's middle initial if you're trying to save room? People complain about folks nowadays being lazy, but I could at least bring myself to use 3 extra letters to spell out George in this script. In Birmingham, we often portray the economic development of the community as a straight line going ever upward. And while that may be generally true, the life of Robert Opdyke reminds us that general trends are not an individual's life. And while old portraits of unsmiling people may give us the idea that folks in the past shouldered their burdens and soldiered on stoically, we also see time and time again that it's simply not true. People have always been the same, and some of us have always run away from our problems. People have always been intrigued by missing persons mysteries as well. The story of Robert Opdyke was printed in papers all over Michigan and possibly beyond because it's a compelling mystery and a very human story. Or a very compelling story of a whole family in on a scam. You decide. Join us next week for a look at the woman, the myth, and the legend, Martha Baldwin. How did a single woman, living at a time when women had very little legal or social power, shape Birmingham in her own image? It's all in the threat and levering child labor, my dear Watson. To see photos of the mill that Robert owned, read the newspaper stories about the mystery of his disappearance, and see other photos and documents related to the Opdyke family, check out our website. The link is in the show notes. For comments, concerns, or episode suggestions, feel free to email us at museum@bhamgov.org. I'm Caitlin Donnelly, and thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a rating and review.